Welcome to On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsom and I'm here for the final pay-per-view of 2022, and we've got the light heavyweight championship on the line. This is now a vacant light heavyweight championship. Initially, we're supposed to have had the rematch between Jiří Procházka and Glover Teixeira, but Jiří Procházka suffered what seems to be a nasty shoulder injury, so he's going to be out for quite a while. So he actually vacated the belt himself, which was good of him to do so, and one thing led to another. I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but we ended up getting Jan Blachowicz versus Ankalaev, which was already on the card as a 3-round fight, bumped up to the 5-round main event for the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship. I just want to apologise in advance. I am a little bit under the weather, so if my voice sounds a little bit croaky or anything like that, then I'm sure you can appreciate why. But just before we get into the breakdowns, as always, there is going to be a Base AI recap from last weekend's event. Actually, Base AI did a really good job last weekend because a lot of underdogs won and it still maintained a solid straight pick prediction accuracy. But that'll be on the Base AI playlist on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/MMA Play 365. So if you are interested in the AI, the algorithms, the UFC prediction software from Base AI, then make sure you check that out. So straight into the breakdowns, we have got 14 fights. Again, it's another big card, so I'll try and get through this as effortlessly as possible. In the main event for the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship, as I've already mentioned, we've got Jan Blachowicz versus Magomed Ankalaev. Now, for those that have been following me for years and years, you'll know how I feel about Dagestani-born Russians, and those that have been following me for a long time as well will know that quite a while ago I predicted 3 future UFC champions, some which people laughed at me for, but you know, I come good with the Dagestanis. I always bring those Dagestani goods. Those 3 fighters were Islam Makhachev, now the UFC lightweight champion, Magomed Ankalaev, the future UFC light heavyweight champion, and Khamzat Chimaev, the future whatever champion he wants to be in regards to the division. So, as you can probably imagine, you know which way I'm going to be leaning on this fight, and I think that, you know, it's nothing against Jan Blachowicz. I genuinely think Ankalaev is the best light heavyweight fighter on the planet. I think that his skill set is just super difficult to not only deal with, but it's going to be really difficult for a fighter to beat Ankalaev. Even if you steal around, or, you know, if it's a 3-round fight, even if you steal around along the way, or if it's a 5-round fight, you might steal around and do well in another round. I just feel like it's going to be really difficult to get the better of Ankalaev across an entire fight, and Jan Blachowicz will do some good work in this fight. I think from a striking perspective, both fighters put out a similar amount of volume, so that's going to be fairly even in this fight. But where Ankalaev, I think, has the edge in the striking is the fact that his defense is so tight. He's actually got a 60% striking defense statistic, which might not sound very high, but if you look at other good fighters in the UFC, you know, even champions, 60% is quite high. Everything's tight with Ankalaev. He doesn't waste too many strikes. He doesn't throw in long combinations, which isn't ideal, but again, he's got good technique, he's got good accuracy, he does have deceptive power in his striking as well. He'll mix between his hands and his kicks, and when you start looking at the wrestling and grappling, I think that's where you really start to see big advantages in this fight for Ankalaev. Like, Jan Blachowicz was stuck under Glover Teixeira and ultimately finished when he lost his title. And you can argue that Glover Teixeira's top game is one of the best in the division, and, you know, you'd be right. But the fact is, Jan Blachowicz is a BJJ black belt, so you would assume from a BJJ black belt they would have some level of being active and trying to get back up to the feet. Maybe that was just a one-off fight for Blachowicz, but then he goes in there against Rakic, and sure, he beats Rakic due to that injury, that pre-fight injury as well, but in that second round, Rakic took Jan Blachowicz down and controlled more than 4.5 minutes of the 5-minute round. Jan Blachowicz was stuck on his back, he couldn't really do anything, and I just feel that Ankalaev, although he doesn't use his wrestling as much as what I think he should, I just feel that he hasn't used his wrestling that much because he's not really needed to. I think he is going to have to lean on that in this fight. And I think his wrestling is some of the best in the division, if not the best. I think his top game's crushing. I know he was submitted by Paul Craig, but that was a long time ago. It was, you know, a very, very strange anomaly that happened there. But I think that Ankalaev's got way too many advantages in this fight for him to lose. I think from a striking perspective, it can be close, but I think Ankalaev's defense will prevent Jan Blachowicz from really pulling away from the striking. Then when you look at the wrestling and grappling, I think those are massive advantages for Ankalaev. So I do think Blachowicz will do some good work. I think he'll have some good moments. Will he take a round or two? Maybe. But over the course of the fight, if there's a finish, I anticipate that more being on Ankalaev's side. And if it does go to a decision, I'd be shocked if Jan Blachowicz took 3 out of the 5 rounds. So for those reasons, I'm picking Magomed Ankalaev to win this fight and become the new UFC light heavyweight champion. And in the next fight, the co-main event, we've got Paddy the Baddy Pimblett versus Jared Gordon. I'm really excited for this fight because I feel like it's this fight that Paddy Pimblett's finally getting that real solid test. And I don't mean any disrespect to his previous opponents in the UFC. The UFC, I think, have done a really good job in building him up step by step the way it needed to be done. Because it did need to be done that way. You know, Paddy, if they threw Paddy in there with Jared Gordon on his UFC debut, it would have been a really difficult fight. But the thing is, Paddy is still developing as a fighter, and this is where you've got to be really careful because Jared Gordon is by far the best fighter that Paddy Pimblett will have fought to date. But like I said, you've got to take into consideration that Paddy is looking better and better every time we see him. He's a fighter that's got a ton of confidence. Even though we're not going to be in the UK for this fight, I'd still imagine that the crowd's going to be going nuts for Pimblett as well. It's going to feel like a home fight for him for sure. But like I said, the key thing here is development. Now, I can see Paddy Pimblett's development from fight to fight with his previous fights when I'm watching tape, sure. However, what I can't do is see future development. So I don't know how much he's going to develop or have developed, if he has developed at all from his last fight to this fight. So I've got to basically judge Paddy Pimblett from his last fight versus the Jared Gordon that I do feel like is a finished product. And I don't mean that as he's declined. I just mean that, you know, we know what we're going to get with Jared Gordon. I don't think he's a fighter that is going to be making those leaps and bounds and improvements. But what Jared Gordon is a very good all-round fighter. He does have some holes, sure, so does every fighter, but he's very solid everywhere. He's a good striker, and that's a good striker moving forwards, moving backwards. He's a good wrestler. He's a good grappler. And Jared Gordon really has only lost to, you know, some of the real good fighters in the division. So I feel that with Jared Gordon, training partners with Belal Muhammad, you can see the developments he's made. So, look, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Jared Gordon is improving himself. He's been with the Dagestani boys during Makhachev's camp, I believe, when he beat Charles Oliveira. So he's been around all the Dagestanis. Obviously, Belal Muhammad was cornered by Khabib, so Jared Gordon must have been around Khabib as well. And I feel that Jared Gordon's got actually an okay fight here and a chance to really derail a hype train and, you know, shock quite a lot of people that are expecting Paddy Pimblett to win. And this is where it becomes a difficult fight to predict, because I actually wouldn't be shocked if Paddy has made these crazy developments, comes out here and starches Jared Gordon, and then the world is then put on notice. But I have to lean with the side that I think has got the fighter that has fought the better level of competition, that's got more experience, that is leaps and bounds ahead of anybody that their opponent has fought previously, and that fight is Jared Gordon. I just feel that he's a really well-rounded fighter, and whichever way Paddy takes this fight, remember Paddy's more comfortable as a grappler, or, you know, that appears to be where he's more comfortable. I feel like, can he take Gordon down? I think it's going to be difficult. Can he keep him down if he has got him down? Can he submit him? You know, you look at Gordon against a guy like Grant Dawson last time out, and it took Dawson a lot to really get into Gordon and then eventually finish him. I'm not quite sure Paddy Pimblett's at that level of like a Grant Dawson where he is going to be able to take him out. Maybe I'm wrong, but like I said, I'm going to be siding with the fighter that I do think is tough, gritty, ugly in regards to his style, well-rounded everywhere, more experienced, had a good camp, got seriously good training partners that will be able to help specifically for the style of Paddy Pimblett. So for those reasons, I am going to be siding with Jared Gordon to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is a fight between two serious fan favourites, and fan favourites for years and years. We've got Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Robbie Lawler. And I think that this is definitely a fight where Ponzinibbio should be coming out on top. Robbie Lawler, obviously, we all know and love over the years, but I do feel that, even though, listen, both fighters are coming into this fight and losing streaks, but Robbie Lawler seems to be much more declined at this point. You know, Santiago Ponzinibbio's losses have been close, and against fighters that are in the here and now, and a good here and now. Robbie Lawler's only win since 2017, aside from obviously Donald Cerrone early 2017, has been Nick Diaz, who came in overweight, out of shape, just seemingly looking to get in there for a paycheck. All these other fighters have been beating Robbie Lawler, and I feel that Robbie Lawler just has lost a step or two. I think that Santiago, Ponzinibbio, it's going to be a fight where both fighters are likely going to be brawling. Both fighters are going to be throwing high volume, trying to take each other out. And I just feel that at this point, Ponzinibbio is a much greater hammer than what Robbie Lawler is. And I think Robbie Lawler is the nail at this point. And ultimately, I think that's how the fight's going to play out. I don't anticipate seeing too much wrestling or grappling. And if we do, the fight won't be won and lost in the wrestling and grappling departments. I think it's going to be a bit of a brawl. I think both fighters are going to throw down, and ultimately, I think it's Ponzinibbio that's just going to be the much better nail than what Robbie Lawler's going to be. I think he's going to put that hammer down. I think he's going to hurt Lawler, and again, I do think there's going to be a knockout in this fight. I just don't envisage it being Lawler knocking Ponzinibbio out. So for those reasons, I'm picking Santiago Ponzinibbio to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Darren Till versus Dricus du Plessis. And when we're talking about fighters that are declining, that aren't where they used to be and probably won't get back to where they used to be, I really hope I'm wrong, but I feel like that is Darren Till. I feel like he's got a lot of wear and tear at this point. He's been in some wars. He's suffered, some bad knockouts. I feel that he's just not the fighter that he once was. I feel like he's probably lost a step in regards to his sharpness and his speed. And again, I hope I'm wrong. Like, I'm just basing this off what I've seen, what we're seeing in training. He's looking like he's going through a lot of wars. And then when you look at someone like Dricus du Plessis, who is a fighter that is growing from strength to strength in the UFC. Obviously, last time out, I bet against him against Brad Tavares. And although Brad Tavares, did weather a storm, and Brad Tavares did have him in some difficult spots in that round one, du Plessis to come back in the way that he did, even though he looked absolutely gassed at the end of round one and then took round 2 and 3 from a cardio machine like Brad Tavares, I feel that du Plessis has taken that, will be able to take that fight, learn a lot from it, and come back even better. And that's where I think that Darren Till is going to have problems, because I feel that from a striking perspective, du Plessis is going to be more aggressive. I think he's going to have more power. I think his durability is greater as well. Cardio-wise, I still do have some questions over du Plessis, but he is answering those from fight to fight. Then when you look at the wrestling, I think that du Plessis is going to be a better wrestler. From an offensive perspective versus the defensive Darren Till, maybe du Plessis doesn't score any takedowns, but I don't envisage Darren Till being able to take du Plessis down. I think if they do start grappling, du Plessis is going to be much better than Darren Till from a grappling perspective, especially when you consider that it's more likely to be du Plessis on top than Darren Till. So I feel that, it's a fight that just suits du Plessis. The right time, the right moment. I feel it is du Plessis' time. Like I said, I think he's going to be more dangerous, more aggressive on the feet. Then if we do start seeing some wrestling and grappling mixed in, I think du Plessis' got advantages there as well. Like I said, I hope I'm completely wrong. I hope that Darren Till is the Darren Till of old. He comes back, because if this is the Darren Till, for example, that fought Robert Whittaker, he's going to absolutely school Dricus du Plessis. But I'm just not convinced we're going to see that version of Darren Till. And if we do, then, I'll hold my hands up. But until I see that, I can't really predict it confidently. So for those reasons, I am going to be picking Dricus du Plessis to win this fight. And in the next fight, I've got a funny feeling this is going to be the people's main event, the fight to watch here. I think that, or I hope that both of their fight teams just wrap them in bubble wrap, make sure nothing happens to them throughout fight week. We've got Bryce Mitchell versus Ilia Topuria. This is going to be a highly competitive fight, and before we even talk about analysis, it's not often that we get a 15-0 unbeaten fighter fighting a 12-0 unbeaten fighter at the top of the division, and whoever wins this fight is going to absolutely rock it up the division. It's going to put the fighter that loses back a couple of fights, but it's going to be a couple of fights that they'll probably pick back up within the next sort of maybe 6 to 8 months and be right back on that train again up the top of the division. I genuinely feel like both Bryce Mitchell and Ilia Topuria, the ceilings are super high. They're both really good fighters. And you look at Bryce Mitchell's a fighter that his striking is a work in progress. But last time out against Edson Barboza, he drops Edson Barboza. How many fighters can say that they've stood toe-to-toe with one of the long-standing, most dangerous, devastating strikers in UFC history and drop them? And you can say Edson Barboza, he's not the Barboza he used to be, and he's not far off it. Like, Edson Barboza's still a dangerous fighter. He's still going to knock fighters out. He's still a fighter you really don't want to stand for too long with. And only the best fighters have really took it to Edson Barboza. And Bryce Mitchell dropped him in round 1 and then dominated him pretty much for the rest of the fight once he got his wrestling and grappling going. And that's where Bryce Mitchell really shines, within his grappling. The thing is, Topuria is his base is grappling. It's BJJ. He's also a very, very good grappler. Now, when you look at Topuria's striking, I think Topuria's striking is slightly more polished than Mitchell's. I think he's going to be dangerous because he does have power in his hands. He's knocked his last 3 opponents out. But again, I feel like that might actually play against Topuria in a way, and it's something that's happened to a lot of good BJJ guys, Gilbert Burns included. These BJJ guys, once they start finding these big knockouts, they tend to fall in love with the knockout, stop trying to wrestle and grapple because they just love seeing their opponent, on the backs with looking up at the bright lights and, getting a highlight reel knockout on your record. And I feel like Topuria might fall into that. But the one thing that you can be sure of in this fight, or relatively sure of, is Mitchell is going to look to wrestle. So at least, like sometimes when you get with 2 grapplers, you'll get a fight that ends up on the feet because they both respect each other's grappling. Mitchell, he will strike to start with. Of course, all fights start standing, but he will be the one engaging in the wrestling and grappling. So I feel that both fighters are going to be in these crazy scrambling exchanges. I think the grappling, they're both going to be looking for sweeps, reversals, submissions, and looking to dominate to the point where I do actually think the fight's going to be won and lost in that wrestling and grappling department. Now, I kind of think that Bryce Mitchell's a slightly better wrestler here, which should, in theory, mean that he has some, or at least starts in the better positions on the mats. Maybe Topuria does sweep and reverse, but I do think that Mitchell's more likely to go heavy wrestling, whereas Topuria is more likely to try and keep the fight up, standing for as long as possible. And again, I actually think it'd suit Topuria more to wrestle himself and try and get on top of Mitchell. But I do feel that whoever is having the better exchanges or getting topside first is the more likely fighter to have or get the better of the exchanges, get the better of the rounds in regards to that grappling and the BJJ. And I kind of feel that edges towards Mitchell, but it wouldn't surprise me for Topuria to come out here with the feeling out process and just land something that knocks Mitchell out. I just think it's a really well-matched fight. I think it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be wild. I think both fighters are absolutely going to have the moments. I think it is a really, really close fight, but stylistically, I'm slightly edging towards Mitchell. So for those reasons, I'm picking Bryce Mitchell to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got 2 fighters coming in on 3-fight losing streaks. So it is one of those fights where, unfortunately, the loser might end up having to look for a new promotion to fight in, which is a shame. But we've got Edmen Shahbazyan versus Dalcha Lungiambula. Now, Edmen Shahbazyan, I feel like the UFC are giving him the big reset button here, and I kind of feel like it's needed because Shahbazyan really rose into the UFC very, very quickly. He was branded a prospect after just a fight or two, and everybody was talking about how he's the next biggest thing in the division, and then suddenly they put him against someone like Brad Tavares. He takes him out, knocks him out early, and now Shahbazyan's ready for the top of the division. He fights Derek Brunson. That's going to be a difficult fight for any fighter. Loses comfortably. Then he fights Jack Hermansson. Again, he's a fighter that's been at the top of the division for years. Loses to Jack Hermansson. Then they give him Imavov, a fighter who's on a similar rise to Shahbazyan. Shahbazyan loses to Imavov. Imavov, again, he's a very, very good fighter. So I feel that those 3 losses that Shahbazyan's taken, the UFC are just hitting that reset button. He's young enough to, start again, start getting some wins together. And I think the UFC have matched this fight for that specific reason, where you look at Dalcha Lungiambula, the 3 fights he's lost, just the level of competition just isn't even close to the competition Shahbazyan's been fighting. And it's a shame because I like Dalcha Lungiambula, but I do think that the UFC have matched this fight to get Shahbazyan back in the win column. And of course, Dalcha Lungiambula is big, he's powerful, he's strong, he's athletic. Maybe he does catch Shahbazyan with something. Shahbazyan hasn't looked great from that durability perspective. So maybe Lungiambula, that is his path to victory. And maybe he can look to capitalise and catch Shahbazyan with something. But I feel that from a stylistic perspective, from a skill set perspective, Edmen Shahbazyan's going to have the speed advantage here. I don't think he's going to hit it as hard, but I think he's going to be able to output some nice volume. I think the way he mixes in his hands and his kicks is going to be able to keep it varied enough where Lungiambula is struggling to get inside and land himself. I think when you're looking at the wrestling and grappling, Shahbazyan has got a big advantage here over Lungiambula. I think the takedowns are going to be there for Shahbazyan. I'm not sure Lungiambula gets back up easily, or if he does get up easily, if Shahbazyan keeps on the takedowns, I think the more takedowns he lands, the more it's going to really, take the wind out of Lungiambula and prevent him from being able to get back up to his feet and maybe take some of that morale from him as well. I do feel like it's a fight that's favourable to Shahbazyan, although Lungiambula, he does have that puncher's chance with that athleticism, that explosiveness, and the fact that he's big and he's powerful. But I am going to be siding with the fighter who I believe is the better mixed martial artist. So for that reason, I'm picking Edmen Shahbazyan to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is a fight that I think could be low-key really fun as well, that I don't feel like a lot of people are going to be talking about until they see it. We've got Billy Quarantillo versus Alexander Hernandez. And again, we talk about once hyped prospects. Alexander Hernandez was on the radar of absolutely everybody at one point, but again, sort of fell off that cliff a little bit and, didn't turn out the way that a lot of people expected, or maybe didn't have the journey that a lot of people expected to this date right now. And it's going to be interesting to see how Hernandez approaches this fight. The only two fighters that Hernandez has beaten since 2020 are Mike Breeden and Chris Gruetzemacher, who A, are nowhere near the quality of Billy Quarantillo, and B, fighters that he should be beating. And I feel like Billy Quarantillo is another good step, because obviously Alexander Hernandez last time out lost against Renato Moicano. I think a lot of people are expecting Hernandez to do a little bit better, but I also think people forgot who Renato Moicano was. So I don't really hold it against Alexander Hernandez for that fight, even though he did have some moments in that first round. So Billy Quarantillo is that right step down from Renato Moicano, but I think that Billy Quarantillo is going to pose a lot of problems for Hernandez, because Hernandez likes to be explosive on the feet. He likes to mix in kicks with his hands, put combinations together, but Billy Quarantillo is going to have some good speed, and he's got this awkwardness of his striking and good volume as well, and he's durable and he can step forward through some hard shots and land combinations himself, which can sometimes break his opponents. But then you look at Alexander Hernandez, his background's in wrestling. Does he lean on his wrestling in this fight? Well, if he's taking Quarantillo down, Quarantillo's a nightmare to deal with on the mat. He's BJJ black belt, he's tough, he's scrappy, he's scrambly, and I just feel that Hernandez's wrestling and top game is really fine and polished, but it's too nice. Whereas I think Quarantillo, like I said, is a scrappy scrambler, and he'll just cause mayhem on the mat for Alexander Hernandez. So it begs the question is, can Alexander Hernandez really start pulling away with rounds in this fight? And I'm not quite sure he can. I think Billy Quarantillo is going to do enough work here to just pop the straight shots out there, to rack up some volume. I think Quarantillo might end up shooting for some takedowns as well. From a cardio perspective, Quarantillo can tire, but he tires and hits this brick wall where he doesn't seem to get any worse, and he can still fight at that lowest level of his gas tank, whereas Alexander Hernandez, when he does tire, he tires and slows down considerably. And I think that the bottom barrel of Alexander Hernandez's gas tank isn't anywhere close to that bottom barrel of Quarantillo's. I'll get my teeth in. So I do think that Quarantillo's got some advantages in this fight. I think wherever the fight goes, he's going to be able to be competitive and should have slight edges over Alexander Hernandez. So for those reasons, I'm going to be picking Billy Quarantillo to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fighter making their UFC debut from Dana White's Contender Series. We've got Erik Silva versus TJ Brown. Now, the one thing that threw me to start with is Erik Silva's 35 years old. He's still young in his career, in his MMA career. He hasn't had many fights, so he doesn't have the mileage. But I did find it quite interesting how the UFC took him on the Contender Series at 35, and he's making his UFC debut at 35, which technically 35 is well past your prime, especially for a featherweight, maybe not a heavyweight, but as you're coming down into the lighter divisions. So that's the first thing that I noticed, and I was like, okay, well, this is interesting, because the dude must offer something if the UFC are loving a 35-year-old. And man, I can see exactly why UFC love him. The dude's got insane power for a featherweight, and again, I don't mean any disrespect to featherweights. Obviously, the lighter you come down in the weight classes, the less likely or the less knockouts that you see, just because the weight's down. It's it's science. But the dude's got insane power. He's got insane grappling. He's got good wrestling. He's got good scrambling. Even because sometimes he does rush the positions from a grappling perspective. Sometimes he can make a mistake and end up in a disadvantageous position, but he recovers that position because he's a good grappler. And then you've got TJ Brown. TJ Brown is again, a really good fighter. Has got power in his hands. He's got decent striking, like relatively polished striking. Then he's got this wrestling game too. He's got some grappling, but again, he also can rush positions and make mistakes on the mat. I think this fight is going to be an absolute car crash in the best way possible. That is not a negative to this fight. Like, this fight is going to be super fun. It's definitely up there it's got to be up there for a potential fight of the night. And I think that both fighters are going to be scrambling. They're going to have the moments. Both fighters are going to end up being in top position. Both fighters are going to end up getting hit with some hard shots and landing hard shots themselves. So it's just going to be a really, really fun fight. And I actually like Erik Silva in this fight. I think that TJ Brown, for as fun as he is, I just feel like he makes more mistakes than what Erik Silva will. I appreciate Silva's debut, and he's 35, but like I said, TJ Brown, I think, is a little untrustworthy at times. I think Erik Silva is going to have the power in this fight. I think he's live for a knockout, or at least a knockdown. I think he's more live for a submission. I think when you're looking at the wrestling could be really close here, but that's what's going to cause the fun scrambles. But then the fun scrambles, I think that Silva just makes less mistakes than what TJ Brown makes. I think Silva's slightly more polished in regards to his BJJ grappling and obviously the chaotic scrambles. So I just feel that there's a few edges in this fight that give Silva enough upside to be able to beat TJ Brown here. So for those reasons, I'm picking Erik Silva to win this fight. And in the next fight, I'm quite surprised this fight is this far down on the card, if I'm being honest, even though it is a pay-per-view. We've got Jairzinho Rozenstruik versus Chris Daukaus in the UFC heavyweight division. And I feel like it's a really interesting fight. And it's a fight that both fighters need to win. And the reason being is that both fighters are coming into this fight on back-to-back 2-fight losing streaks. Both of them have lost to Curtis Blades. Then Chris Daukaus lost to Derek Lewis. Jairzinho Rozenstruik lost to Alexander Volkov. So I think that there's no shame in the fighters that they've lost to in the 2-fight losing streak they're both coming into, but I think they're being matched at the right time. And it's difficult because I feel like Rozenstruik has got a massive upside in the knockout power here. Chris Daukaus has shown now that he can be knocked out and finished, and this is starting to become a little bit of a question mark of how durable he actually is going to be coming into this fight, because Rozenstruik does hit very hard. He has that touch of death, and obviously it's the UFC heavyweight division. However, Chris Daukaus has got a big speed advantage, a big movement advantage. I think he's got a volume advantage in this fight as well. If we're looking at the wrestling and grappling, Daukaus is more likely to wrestle. I think Daukaus has got a big jiu-jitsu advantage over Rozenstruik as well. It's just that big question of, Rozenstruik, if he can catch Daukaus coming in, then he's likely going to knock him out, and that's a huge path to victory for Rozenstruik. That's not your average and normal puncher's chance. That's a serious path to victory for Rozenstruik. So it does beg the question of which way is this fight going to go. We're going to see that brutal knockout, that one-punch knockout of Rozenstruik, or are we going to see Daukaus really drag this fight long? Because again, another advantage Daukaus has got is the cardio. And this is where I am starting to lean over to Chris Daukaus, because sure, he's got that question mark over the durability, and sure, Rozenstruik's got that huge power, which I've already mentioned, but when a fighter's got speed, movement, volume, wrestling, grappling, and cardio advantage, it's kind of hard to look past that guy, even though, like I've said, that puncher's chance is elevated and exaggerated to a greater extent than ever before. It still leans me towards the fighter that's got the more slight advantages in this fight, and I do believe that Daukaus is the better mixed martial artist. So for those reasons, I'm picking Chris Daukaus to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Chris Curtis versus Joaquin Buckley, and I was a little bit disappointed with Chris Curtis's last fight. I was there in London, watched him against Jacobans, and I actually bet Chris Curtis as an underdog as well, and I feel that Curtis could have done more in that fight. I feel like he just let Jack Hermansson come at him. I do think that Chris Curtis was looking for a brawl and looking to really start exchanging with Hermansson, but you can't expect your opponent to come in and do what you want him to do, or do what she wants to do. You can't expect that. And I feel like Chris Curtis just held back because of that, ended up getting really frustrated. And with Buckley, he's going to get that. So Buckley is going to come forward. He is going to give Curtis exactly the fight he wants. So this is a close fight. And I also think it's a fight that is going to be exciting and a fight that both fighters are going to get exactly what they want, because Joaquin Buckley doesn't want a long striker sitting on the outside, striking in, moving backwards every time he comes in trying to be explosive. Chris Curtis won't do that, at least not for the most part. He'll stay in there, he'll stand and bang. And I think that's going to favour Buckley. I think it favours both fighters. Both fighters will like this fight. But Buckley, for me, is slightly more explosive. He's got more power. I think his combinations are big and wild. And in these short combinations inside of boxing range, sure, Chris Curtis is the slightly more polished striker from a boxing perspective. But Buckley, like I said, he's so powerful, big, explosive, athletic. I just feel that he's got advantages in this fight. Then when you're looking at the wrestling, Buckley's not really known for his wrestling, but it is something that he has been working on and improving at Extreme Couture, which is one of the best wrestling gyms for MMA on the planet. So I feel like Buckley might have a wrestling advantage should he want to go there, but I think that this fight is going to be, an absolute slinger where both fighters are just looking to take each other's chins into rosette. And I think that fight, although both fighters will like it, I think it favours Buckley more. So for those reasons, I'm picking Joaquin Buckley to win this fight. And in the next fight, the flyweight division, we've got Daniel Da Silva versus Vinicius Salvador. Now, Daniel Da Silva, he really needs a win here. He's on a 3-fight losing streak, one of them being Jeff Molina, which isn't a bad loss, but his last 2 fights, he should have been getting at least something out of at least one of those fights, in my opinion, if he is to be that UFC level fighter. And I'm just not convinced he is. But on a 3-fight losing streak, if he comes in here and loses against Salvador, who's making his UFC debut, I genuinely think that it could be a problem for Daniel Da Silva, maybe looking at another promotion to fight under, which, again, I always hate to talk about and hate to say, but a 3-fight losing streak, if you lose your 4th, it's normally, that's normally it, and that's normally how the UFC operates. Vinicius Salvador is an absolute madman. So obviously, similar to what I just said with Erik Silva a couple of fights ago, this is madman number 2, Salvador. This dude is nuts. He's crazy. He's powerful. Again, for flyweight, insane power. He will land hard shots. He'll drop his opponents. He'll knock his opponents out. He comes out like a bull, 1,000,000 miles an hour at the first bell. Then he's got decent grappling as well. And this guy, again, I feel that he's got holes in his game that once he starts fighting real UFC level competition, which I do think that he's going to start climbing the rankings pretty fast, but when he starts fighting really good strikers, I feel like he does leave a lot of openings for himself to be hit, and he has been hit. We have seen him tested in regards to taking hard shots. He does have relatively good durability, but again, there's only so long you can lean on that before you really start getting hurt, rocked, wobbled, and knocked out. But that's in the future. That's for another day. Right now with Daniel Da Silva, I think Vinicius Salvador is going to be way too much for him. I think he's going to be a massive handful. I think that he's going to land something that hurts Daniel Da Silva early, whether he knocks him out, whether he finds a submission. I just don't feel that this is a fight where Daniel Da Silva is going to last. You look at the cardio of Salvador, even though he comes out hard and fast and, throws an insane amount of volume and a barrage of strikes, it can run into round 2. His cardio will pull through. And I feel that, again, it's a nightmare matchup for Daniel Da Silva, because Daniel Da Silva, does he catch Salvador and knock him out? Obviously, if he's finding holes, if he can find gaps in Salvador's striking, then maybe he can give himself a chance. But as I've already said, we've seen Salvador being hit hard enough as it is. And then Daniel Da Silva, does he get his wrestling going, get the takedowns going? Well, it's going to be difficult if you're constantly on the back foot, which I anticipate with the aggression that Salvador brings, that Daniel Da Silva is going to struggle for takedowns. I just think it's a tough fight for Daniel Da Silva. I think Vinicius Salvador could potentially be a fan favourite after fight night on Saturday. So I'm picking Vinicius Salvador to win this fight. And the next fight features the youngest fighter on the UFC roster. We've got Perrin versus the 18-year-old Raul Rosas Jr. And Raul Rosas Jr. was the fighter, obviously, famously signed to the Contender Series at 17 years old, which is insane. He needed special clearance from the Nevada State Athletic Commission, also parental permission as well, I think. So absolutely crazy. And I feel like a lot of people might look at Perrin here and think, right, this is a man that's going to give a very, very young man a problem in regards to, experience, strength. And, I thought the same thing when I went into tape. I thought, Raul Rosas Jr., he must be good. I'd not seen him before I watched tape. So I thought he must be good if he's being signed, if the UFC are signing a fighter this young. But Jay Perrin with experience and, being a much older man with that man strength. And I just feel that he could have been a potential option here to beat Rosas. But actually watching tape, man, like Rosas' grappling is insanely good. And it is very good where he's going to be competitive with a lot of these fighters in the division. And you can definitely see why the UFC have signed him now. The striking's a little bit of a work in progress. It's a little bit wild. He looks a little bit raw, a little bit green. Not too raw and green, though. But, you can see that there's developments to be made there. But the thing is, he is 18 years old. The amount of development that he is going to be doing fight by fight and improving fight by fight is insane. So you've got to assume that Raul Rosas Jr.'s striking in this fight is going to be much better than what it was before. And Jay Perrin's going to be a game opponent. But there's no way that I can see the UFC signing a fighter this young, a fighter that's going to have a lot of spotlight because of his age, and he's going to have a lot of this screen time at the on the pay-per-view event, obviously not the pay-per-view portion. There's no way that the UFC sign Rosas Jr. and put him in a fight where they're going to expect him to lose. And I know it doesn't always work out like that, but what I'm saying is from a matchmaking perspective, it's the matchmaker's job to make sure that the right fighters are fighting in the right spots. And I just don't think that the UFC matchmakers have made this fight for Rosas Jr. to lose. I think that Jay Perrin is absolutely good enough to provide the test that the UFC want Raul to go through. I think Jay Perrin's good enough to maybe put Raul in some compromising positions, make him fight through some adversity. But I think when all is said and done, Raul Rosas Jr. is going to be able to find the takedowns he needs. His wrestling is very, very good as well. So I feel like he's going to have the takedowns that he needs. I think he's going to be able to control large portions of this fight from a grappling perspective. And I actually think that Raul Rosas Jr. could potentially finish this fight as well and potentially choke Jay Perrin out, submit him. So I think that it's a fight perfect for Raul Rosas Jr. He's not going to walk over anybody. It is going to be competitive at moments. Perrin is going to have his moments, but ultimately I think Raul Rosas Jr.'s style, his skill set is going to be enough to drag him through this one, potentially get a finish along the way as well, and then look to make further developments before the next time we see him, with him being so young. So for those reasons, I'm picking Raul Rosas Jr. to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is a strange one. I can't remember the last time we saw Ovincent Prue this low down on the card, but we've got Ovincent Prue versus the newcomer Antonio Trocoli. Now, with Antonio Trocoli, it's a strange one. He won his Contender Series fight, was signed to the UFC, but then he was released after he popped with USADA for something. So it must have been a contaminated supplement that they've been able to, scientifically prove, because otherwise the UFC wouldn't have re-signed him. In my opinion, I don't think they would have at all. But they've signed him. He's now stepping in on short notice against Ovincent Prue, which provides the only issue that I've got with Antonio Trocoli. I feel like if this was a full camp, the Antonio Trocoli would definitely be a fighter that has got every chance of beating somebody like Ovincent Prue. And listen, with Ovincent Prue, OSP, with the fact that he's aging and he is declining and he isn't the fighter that he once was, I do think that Trocoli's still got a good chance of beating him, but I just feel on short notice it provides an extra couple of question marks that wouldn't have been there if that was a full camp, is what I'm trying to say. I think that Ovincent Prue, I'll call him OSP from now, but I think OSP, he's got power, he's got the striking ability, he's definitely got experience, and OSP makes this experience and veteranship, if for a lack of a better word, matter in his fights. And we see that when these younger fighters come in and they're supposed to be running straight through OSP, he has other plans, he uses experience, slows the fight down, gets the fight at his own pace, and he's able just to pick away at him, potentially find a finish and just expose the younger, less experienced fighter. So OSP does do a good job of that. But to be fair, it's normally the fighter that is explosive and powerful and it's looking to knock you out, and has been scoring first round knockouts against much lesser competition that Ovin Semprou seems to be able to nullify. Trocker's a little bit different. Sure, the dude's big. He's absolutely massive, by the way, for the division. But Trocker is more likely to look for takedowns here. His grappling's really good, and that's where he thrives as a fighter. So although he does hit hard, although his striking is okay as well, he's not going to have that game plan of, right, I'm going to knock you out in the first round, otherwise I'm going to probably fade. He's more likely to try and take Ovin Semprou down, and I think he's going to be able to succeed. The only issue is, if he isn't able to take Semprou down initially, then it does worry me. Or if he takes Ovin Semprou down and OSP stands back up to his feet, and he has to score a couple of takedowns, what is the cardio going to look like with it being short notice? But outside of the cardio question marks, I think that Trockley is going to be able to get the fight down to the mat. I think he is going to be able to do good work. I think top side, we're going to see a huge advantage for Trockley, because I feel like his top side BJJ is going to be levels above the defensive BJJ of OSP. On the feet, I feel like it's going to be quite close, but I kind of feel like Trockley isn't going to allow this fight to be won and lost on the feet. I think he is going to be looking for those takedowns. I think he is going to be able to control some good top position, good top positions, have some top position time. And I feel like if he is making OSP work off his back, then maybe OSP is the one that tires out. I think it's a close fight. It wouldn't shock me for OSP to come in here and again just slow everything down, make it really hard for Trockley to take him down, wear Trockley down that way with it being short notice. But I have to pick a side here. I am picking the side of the fighter who is young, who is coming into his UFC career, against the fighter that's aged or aging, declined, not the fighter he used to be. So I'm going to be siding with Trockley. I'm picking Antonio Trockley to win this fight. And in the final fight, the final breakdown of this episode of the podcast, we've got Cameron Simon versus Stephen Kozlow. Stephen Kozlow stepping in on short notice here. I think it's going to be a tough fight for him. However, the one thing that I will say is there's not a lot of tape out there on Stephen Kozlow, so it's always one of them where we watch a fight from a few years ago, suddenly there's been no footage for a couple of years, and a fighter turns up looking completely different to what they've looked like on the footage that we did see from a number of years ago. So again, don't be surprised if Kozlow comes into this fight and he's a much different version of what we have seen. The only tape out there from the tape index at MMA Play 365 that I've seen is obviously a pro fight from a couple of years ago, and then a couple of amateur fights as well, which I don't really take into consideration too much. However, what I do know of Cameron Simon is he's a very good striker, very clean striker. He doesn't rush, he doesn't overexert himself. His striking arsenal is varied between his low kicks, ripping to the body, ripping to the head. His movement in and out of range is good. He's also got a decent wrestling game, a decent grappling game. He's one of these new age MMA fighters that are just genuinely good everywhere. And I feel like Stephen Kozlow could potentially be a bit of a one-trick pony. I don't mean that disrespectfully, because he is a good, or he does appear that he's a good submission artist. But the thing is, I feel like if Kozlow's coming into this fight thinking he's just going to take Simon down and submit him, which I'd imagine to be the game plan, again, just an educated guess, I feel that's going to be really tough to do, because Simon's striking is going to be sharp and on point, which should prevent Kozlow from being able to get into those takedown entries and looking to take Simon down. And Simon's a decent grappler himself. So from what I've seen, the very limited footage, so it can't be too much of a confident pick, I am going to be siding with Simon, because he does look like he could potentially do some really good things in the UFC, and he's really well-rounded, really young, improving from fight to fight himself. So for those reasons, I'm picking Cameron Simon to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the On the Moneyline podcast for UFC 282. As always, thank you for tuning in wherever you're tuning in from, whether that be YouTube or any one of our podcast platforms such as Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Apple Music. So wherever you're listening to, thank you very much. If you can give a like in any way, or if you can give a comment, I'm always happy to have a chat. And obviously all the likes and subscriptions and all that good stuff really helps us out as a brand and as, a platform. So appreciate all the support. As always, I'm Newsome. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.